The fate of the humanities, which you see as represented in the parable of Kamara, but it goes way beyond him. The fate of the humanities is something to be hopeful about, if I read and understood correctly. And you have to be the last man standing in 2025 who actually has hope, who is actually hopeful about the fate of the humanities. Explain that to me. In May of 1924, the Senegalese Muslim scholar Shaykh Musa Kamara must have felt an urgency to document the histories and the cultures of those then subject to French colonization. After years of consulting Arabic manuscripts and collecting oral testimonies from griots, village chiefs, and others, Kamara could not wait any longer. Eager to have his work translated and published into French, he sent off an incomplete manuscript to Henri Gaden, the French lieutenant governor of Mauritania and an amateur philologist. Kamara wagered that Gaden, who had been involved in publishing a cohort of indigenous writers, would be interested in a chronicle about the state that had been established following an Islamic revolution during the peak of the global slave trade. He was right. Gaden wrote back, enthusiastically asking Kamara to send the rest without delay. Kamara took this as a favorable sign and picked up the pace of his work, writing the rest and sending it off within just a few months. But then, Kamara had to wait. He never stopped waiting. All right, welcome to the African Studies channel of the New Books Network. My name is Madina Thiam, and what you just heard was the opening paragraph of one of the most anticipated books of 2025, Textual Life, Islam, Africa, and the Fate of the Humanities. And I'm so honored and delighted to sit today with its author, Wendell Marsh, to discuss this book a little bit. It's coming out in the month of October with Columbia University Press, and we're gonna be discussing the contents of the book, but also the path that led Wendell to write this book. Welcome to the show, Wendell.
Thank you for having me. This has been a dream of mine. Thank you, truly.
And we're doing something actually different, and we're doing a first today, which is that we're recording both an audio version of this podcast that you'll be able to listen to on the usual channels of the New Books Network, as well as a video portion, which we're filming in the beautiful setting of Express Newark. And towards the end of the podcast, we'll explain why we're filming it here. But let's jump in. Wendell, can you just tell us a little bit more about your trajectory? And also, how and why did you become a Black Studies scholar interested in Islam in West Africa?
I had a severe speech impediment as a small child. And it was so severe, in fact, that I couldn't pronounce and distinguish about half of the sounds in the English language. And as you can imagine, not being able to communicate often put me in difficult situations. And one of my most kind of vivid childhood memories was on one such occasion. I think I was in kindergarten, and I don't remember all the details, but what I remember is the feeling of some injustice having been done to me. And, you know, maybe it was an unshared crayon or something of that effect, but I was trying to plead my case, and I was trying to explain what happened, and I just remember these white faces surrounding me, scolding me, the teachers. And I was in quite the bind, but thankfully, my older sister, Wendy, was able to come and translate for me. She was one of the only people in the world who could understand me when I spoke. Not even my parents could actually understand me often, and they would ask her, what was I saying? Anyway, what that kind of early experience did for me is really made me appreciate the power of language, right? The importance of translation and the necessity of study. Study because following that incident, I was diagnosed and had to do hundreds of hours of speech therapy in a very intensive way throughout my elementary years. And so I grew to be quite comfortable in the language classroom, right? I had to formally study my native language in that setting. And by middle school, I was studying French. And by high school, I actually had established a Afrocentric book club at my high school. And, we were trying to learn the other ABCs. And one of the texts I remember reading was this little essay by Du Bois. It's a short essay that he writes encouraging African Americans to study French and Portuguese because half of the continent of Africa's population and much of its diaspora spoke those languages, right? And so the study of language and of different languages took on a new meaning and purpose for me, that it was actually a means to achieve the Pan-African ideal. And so I really committed myself to the study of French for the purposes of kind of Pan-African, Black internationalist solidarity and, unity. And eventually I would kind of take that interests and skills I had developed in French to Senegal. When I was at Morehouse College, I went on a trip led by Spelman sisters who were doing a service learning kind of experience in Medina by Kaolack, which is a global hub of Tijani Sufism. And while I was there, I was taken as one of the few folks in our group who could speak French to see the Sheikh. At this point, it was Sheikh Hassan Cisse, who's now passed. And I just remember being in his room, which was filled with people sitting in little circles all around the room, and he was reclined on his kind of cushions, and he was engaging with the different groups of people speaking English, French, Arabic, Wolof, and probably other languages that I couldn't even recognize. That did something very significant for me, because in every space of the room where there wasn't a person, there was books and papers, most of which was in Arabic. And so at that point in college, I had been in between, choosing between an English major and a history major, right? I was obsessed with literary form, but the canon was so white, right? And even those exceptions to that, which we certainly learned at Morehouse, was, I felt there was a constraint by the kind of European colonial languages in which they were written. And I just wanted to know about what literary traditions were available to me that could take me beyond the plantation and the colonial school. And so Sheikh Hassan Cisse embodied those things that I knew very early on: the power of language, the importance of translation, and the necessity of study.
There's many things in what you said now, these moments of translation. The first one would being with your sister, right? Intervening on your behalf and being this go-between, the power of language, of different languages, but also this moment of encounter with the Sheikh. And now it helps me understand better, actually, the dedication of your book. The first line is, in service to the Sheikh. And I'm glad you brought this moment because it helps us also understand better part of the setting that gave rise to this book. And I want us to go back now to another scholar who is the one that you focus on the most in this book. We opened this discussion and this episode with this story of a failed encounter, the story of a manuscript, and of a broken promise from a French colonial administrator to the Senegalese Muslim scholar, Shaykh Musa Kamara. Tell us more about him. Who was Shaykh Musa Kamara?
Shaykh Musa Kamara was a brilliant writer from colonial era Senegal who wrote in many disciplines in the Arabo-Islamic tradition. He was born in 1864 and he dies in 1945, and he's best known for writing a major history of West Africa, known in Arabic as Zuhur al-Basatin, Fi Tarikh al-Sawadin, or Flowers from Among the Gardens in the History of the Blacks. And he's quite remarkable and singular. not because he was a writer or author, right? He's a part of a very robust intellectual culture in West Africa, but he was a bit idiosyncratic. What I found interesting in returning to Kamara and thinking about his reception is that in the 10 years between 2013 and 2023, there's been more work published about Kamara than in any other 10-year period while he was living or since he perished. And so, we might ask, well, what were some of the contextual factors that led to this resurgence of interest in Kamara? And it actually has to do with two of his other works. I actually have a couple of his works here. So, there's Tabshir Khaif al-Hayran wa Tadhkirihi Bisa'at Rahmatullah al-Karim al-Mannan, or The Announcement of the Fearful and Confused, and his reminder of the breadth of God's mercy, the generous bestower God. Kamara writes these very kind of poetic and cosmic titles for his works. So that work is an autobiography, right? And there's another work that has really come to the attention of people, which is his Akthar Ragabin, Fi Jihad Ba'd al-Nabiyyin, or Those Who Want Jihad the Most After the Prophets. It's actually a very long title, I'll spare you. But in that work, he offers a critique of jihad as a legitimate practice in essentially the modern period. So it's a historical critique. And he says that the biggest problem with jihad is that there's no prophetic leadership to authorize it, first and foremost, and that in the absence of that, the major loss of Muslim life, which in his concrete historical experience accompanied the entire waves of jihad that had occurred between the 17th century and the 19th century. And so this was an important and timely argument for him. And so in the context, if we think about 2013 to 2023, what was happening, you know far better than I about the insurgency in Mali in 2012 and how the broader regional dynamics of a kind of very militant Islamist politics made local references for a more quietist Islam very attractive. And there have been a number of scholars who have found in Kamara such a reference. There's been great work that's been done by people like Muhammad Saeed Ba, a kind of a Arabophone intellectual who's currently leading the Kamara Research Center in Senegal, in Gangel, but also Abdul Malal Diop in Bailo down at Duke, and many others, right? So there's like this robust return to Kamara. And this isn't the first time there's been such a renaissance of Kamara studies. The first one, arguably, was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, right? In this post-independence or nationalist period in Senegal, and in which scholars such as Amr Sam and Mustafa Njai recover Kamara as an important writer of Arabic and kind of making the argument that this is a part of the national literature, right? And in ways that aren't too dissimilar to the ways in which black feminists in the United States recovered someone like Zora Neale Hurston, right, around the same time period, right? And so in the work, when I describe the fate of the humanities, I'm interested in the returns of someone like Kamara. Now, at the heart of the book is a very specific story about Kamara's struggle to get his 1,700-page manuscript translated and published by colonial officials. And, I won't go into detail here. You'll just have to, order the book. But that story is a compelling parable for us that is not only the story of his life, but a larger story about the fate of the humanities amidst political, technological, and epistemic change.
Yeah, and I think you show really well in the book these sort of like different periods and different readings of Kamara, and there is something that various audiences and people speaking to various publics in specific contexts across time can get from this author or decide to read into this author. And I think you do such a great job as showing these successive readings of Kamara. And there may be still, new readings of Kamara awaiting us in the future, who knows?
I believe there is, yeah.
And we'll come back to that and what this means for the fate of the humanities. I want to go back a little bit and really plant the context, both geographical and historical, that this author emerges out of. You introduced him to us a little bit, but your book is also, in a way, one story of the encounter between Islam and French colonialism, but set in a very specific space, a region of West Africa named Futa Toro, that is today located at what is now the border between Senegal and Mauritania, and that also has significance. Again, relating to the encounter between French colonialism and Islam. So can you explain to us a little bit more that relationship and how you understand it? What is specific about the encounter between French colonialism in its various iterations and Islam as it happens in this region of West Africa, Futa Toro, in the lifetime of Shaykh Musa Kamara and the years preceding it also?
Yeah. I think one really effective way of understanding this history and the historical specificity is actually thinking a little bit before Kamara, right? The generation that precedes him, and thinking it through three figures in particular. Bou el-Mogdad Sek, Haj Omar Tal, and Faidherbe, right? The French who's often considered the architect of colonial Senegal, Louis Faidherbe. So if we take Bou el-Mogdad Sek, he's the first salaried employee, African salaried employee of the colony, right? He is an interpreter, a kind of a guide. He facilitates trade going up and down the Senegal River, right? When he's active toward the mid-19th century, he is at one time a kind of representative of Muslim civil society in the colony of Saint Louis and a kind of reliable partner of the colonial state. Now, Bou el-Mogdad Sek comes from a scholarly family, right, that had long been established in St. Louis, a family engaged in long-distance trade, right, both across the Sahara and across the Atlantic. And he comes to kind of represent, in a lot of ways, the set of Muslim interests that saw themselves as being aligned with a mercantile presence that would eventually become a colonial one, right? And we really get a sense of his politics and his kind of vision of the world when juxtaposed with someone like Haj Omar Tal, who is in many ways the most consequential figure of 19th century West Africa, at least in the Sahelian zone, right, for the ways in which he revolutionizes the political, economic, and religious landscape and intellectual landscape of the region. He is a Tijani scholar who leaves Halwar on the banks of the Senegal River in Futa Toro and travels to Mecca and Medina on religious pilgrimage. He serves as a kind of a student and disciple of some of the major Tijani scholars who are in the Arabian Peninsula at the time, and he comes back. And on the way there and upon his return, he actually spends a lot of time in what's now northern Nigeria, and he develops a reputation of being someone with a lot of baraka, of charisma or grace that has like real effects in the world. He is respected as an author and a scholar. He writes this well-known, sophisticated poetry that our colleague Amr Sayed has done some really fantastic work on. But he eventually declares a jihad in 1852, and at first it's against the followers of ancestral religions in West Africa. At this time, Islam had already had a 900-year history or so. And most importantly, a generation before Omar, there had been several initiatives to make Islam the guiding framework for collective life, right? Before the so-called age of jihad or Islamic revolutions, Islam was one point of reference among many, right? One form of life among many. But with that shift of the Islamic revolutions, you had a social, political, economic revolution that centralized Islamic paradigms and Islamic normativity as central in several pockets, right? So Futa Toro, Masina, which you know very well, of course, and a few others. And in between were these pockets of followers of ancestral religions. And at first, Hajj Omar's project seems to be connecting the Muslim political formations, but at a certain point, that process folds back on itself, and he actually declares jihad on another Muslim state in violation of kind of what is conventionally considered as a core principle of Islamic international affairs. Anyway, the reason why he is important is because he, in so many ways, is the exact opposite of Bul Mogdad Sek in his vision of collective Muslim life, right? Hajj Omar wants to establish a space of Islamic economics that is actually kind of distinct and insulated from the Atlantic economy, right? The generation before both Sek and Tao, there had been a political struggle, and our colleague Rudolf Ware, I think, shows this very well, to de-link, so to speak, from the slave economy, and work by Paul Lovejoy also shows this. Anyway, the third figure of that moment is also illustrative, though, right? Louis Faidherbe establishes the architecture of the state, right? And he was a military engineer by training, right? He trained at Metz, the Grande École in France. And his attitude toward Islam was an instrumental one. And a lot of the kind of forms of knowledge, the institutions of learning that are established in colonial Senegal are set up by him. He also sets up the tribunal and the kind of schema for Muslim citizenship in the colony. And between these three, you can kind of triangulate an understanding of Islam as one of debate, one of a fertile kind of intellectual life, right? And this kind of characteristic and feature of Muslim scholars who are confronting the ravages of an emergent capitalism with the slave trade and the kind of solutions they come up with and the responses they come up with really define the kind of repertoires and just culture of debate that Kamara inherits and that he very enthusiastically engages in as he comes of age shortly thereafter.
So, Bul Mogdad Sek, Hajj Omar Tall, and Louis Faidherbe as kind of particularly the first two is a juxtaposition I had not thought about, and now you're making me rethink some of the ways to think about this era and this territory. But you're right, I guess these three characters are instrumental, and what they represent also as I don't want to reduce them to archetypes, but what they represent, instrumental to understanding the world that Shaykh Musa Kamara is born into and works in.
And just to elaborate a little bit, right? So Hajj Omar, is a Haji, and he crosses that Sahelian route, and then he, crosses over and goes north to Egypt and eventually into the Arabian Peninsula. But Sek, in response to Hajj Omar, actually goes to the French and say, you know what, we need our own Haji, right, to combat the propaganda of Hajj Omar. And actually the French fund sex Hajj. And this is actually the beginning of an entire institution of the Hajj in Senegal, and it becomes also a diplomatic mission for the colony. So just to kind of illustrate a little bit what I mean by how we can use these figures to think through that context.
No, absolutely. And I think, it picks a really clear picture of some of the different forces at play in shaping the region and in shaping it in that moment. I want to turn to another aspect of your book. It's not an aspect, in many ways, it's the core of the book, actually. Because as you're saying, you introduce these various readings of Kamara, but this is not actually an intellectual biography of Shaykh Musa Kamara that you're writing. It's also not a reception history of how different peoples in different epochs have read and understood his work, although the book does all of that. But that's not quite what it is. At its core, this is a book about philology. Philology, which you open the book with, which you describe as the love of study, and which you also describe, I'm paraphrasing you, I think, as an under-recognized practice in the tradition of Black thought. I'm going to want us to linger on this a little bit and to really, really understand where you're getting at with this, to really understand what Wendell means with philology and how he deploys it in his book. I've actually asked him to read an excerpt from his book, explaining exactly what philology is, how he understands it, and the power that this concept has had for collective liberation. All right, you can go ahead and read this.
Philology has often been thought of as either a contemporary technical discipline or an antiquated soft science that ordered human difference in racial and religious hierarchies in a time better left in the past. That is, philology was a quintessentially colonial form of knowledge. But if we approach it differently, as a human tradition across time and cultural difference, as indeed the love of study, we might better appreciate what the textual attitude has meant in places as diverse as Malcolm X's prison cell and Kamara's riverside village at the edge of the French colonial empire. Once prized for what it could do, and then dismissed as irrelevant, philology now returns as a vitally human orientation toward the world. In this account, considering philology as a particular form of knowledge has been a way to track developments in the organization of knowledge more broadly. Unburdened from the work of representing reality, philology as the love of study and the cultivation of the textual attitude promises a future for the humanities beyond the world slavery and colonization made. Thus, the story of the Senegalese Muslim scholar Shaykh Musa Kamara, who devoted his life to reading and producing monumental texts that were initially celebrated but eventually disregarded before being retrieved by post-colonial intellectuals, provides a parable of the rise, fall, and return, or the fate of the humanities.
All right, so before we recorded the podcast, I told you this was the most Wendell paragraph ever, and that is why I needed to hear it in your voice. I think at the core of it, you're the person I know the most who lives a textual life. And reading the book and thinking back about many of our discussions, but also just how I see you moving in the world, I was like, yeah, this tracks. The fate of the humanities, which you see as represented in the parable of Kamara, but it goes way beyond him. The fate of the humanities is something to be hopeful about, if I read and understood correctly. And you have to be the last man standing in 2025 who actually has hope, who is actually hopeful about the fate of the humanities. Explain that to me.
So I think first we have to distinguish the humanities as kind of a mode of being and a subjectivity from higher education as a particular institutional arrangement in a specific historical moment, right? Fundamentally, the crisis that we're kind of dancing around isn't really the crisis of the humanities. It's a crisis of higher education more broadly. A couple of weeks ago, Indiana University announced the closure of 100 programs, right? Not just African American studies and French and ballet, but basic science, right? Anything remotely theoretical. And in the coverage of this massive restructuring, the comments, I believe, of the governor was that, we need something more practical, right? Another instance that I read about recently was the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma, which had an honors program that was modeled on the great books format. Western civilization, from the Greeks to the freaks, we can say. But more or less, that was the model, which is an important model, right? Great books, serious engagement. There's an essay that was in making the rounds by the dean of that program. And she said that the closure of that program wasn't because of low student enrollment. It wasn't because it wasn't making money. Actually, they had a robust student participation that was a profitable program. And yet, the board of governors and these folks who actually know nothing about higher education, oftentimes, come in and actually say these programs aren't doing what we need them to. And so we're in the midst of a hostile takeover of specific universities and of particular programs. And we see a conservative, I'm mincing my words, a fascist regime that is conducting a pincher movement, right, on elite universities from one side and targeting these kind of more public schools and restructuring their programs on the other to completely transform higher education as we know it. And that's not about the humanities as such, right? The humanities just comes to be like a stand-in as a kind of example of uselessness. Having made that very important distinction, what I want to emphasize is the humanities is much more than a set of disciplines or a set of subjects especially, right? I want to, following a kind of religious studies perspective, approach the humanities as the commitment to reading again, right? So this is an attitude. This is a posture. This is an orientation toward the world through serious, prolonged, and repeated readings, right? I talk about the textual attitude in the book that I take from Edward Said. It's a kind of passing reference in his Orientalism to develop a critique of the strategically interested study of the non-West. But in the book, I kind of repurpose it to kind of think through how we might think of the place of the textual attitude in an algorithmic age that we're in, right? In a time when AI gives us the illusion of the obsolescence of knowledge, right? The warrant for serious, engaged reading of study can't be market metrics, right? Can't even be some political utility. It actually, its only justification is a set of values that are profoundly traditional, dare I say religious. And so, in short, yes, I'm very hopeful about the fate of the humanities, not because of a calculation, right? Actually, and here I'm thinking about a recent podcast that the anthropologist and theorist Talal Asad gave, where he kind of looked out on our current world, right? Seeing genocide in Gaza, and to that we can add the extraction and war in Congo, and the wars in Sudan, and the kind of gangs that terrorize Haiti, etc. If you kind of look at the evidence and were to make a calculation, we can only be pessimistic, right? There's no room for optimism. But hope, he argues, is distinct from optimism or pessimism, because hope isn't based on calculation, right? It is actually about a deeply profound commitment that is only founded on belief.
In a very practical sense, I want to understand, as an educator, how you translate that in your practice as an educator.
So the most important translation I can make is one that emphasizes slowness, right? Care, attention. In one of the main courses I teach here at Rutgers, the Intro to Africana Studies. And there's a kind of semester 1 and semester 2 sequence. But what I'm trying to do in both of those courses is practice close reading. Reading here might be a passage, it might be a painting, it might be a photograph, some kind of object. And I give them a certain protocol for reading, which I developed in studying Kamara and his mode of commentary, where you kind of confront an object or a claim, and the first thing you have to do is notice it, right? And then you describe it to kind of generate language around it. And then through the language itself, you might formulate a question. And in all of my classes, that's what I'm trying to teach, this NDQ, as I like to say, notice, describe, question. And I want to be clear, it's very basic, right? It's very simple, it's very straightforward, but it's much harder to do. And it requires practice. And over the course of the semester, you can do it, right? But what I'm teaching there is this textual attitude, that engagement. But I'm also teaching something else to accompany the textual. I often structure the course around critical needs: breath, housing, water, food, pleasure. And there, I'm really influenced by Toni Morrison's Nobel lecture from 1993. She talks about dead language and living language. In a lot of ways, I think if you return to that speech, she is announcing AI, right? And she's announcing the problem and the risk of a philosophy of language that is completely complicit in power, right? So she talks about the language of journalism and of the state and ultimately of power. It's a dead language. And she contrasts that with a living language, right? And so by attending to critical needs, we read last semester, for example, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, right? After the fires in Altadena in January, a lot of people were kind of thinking about this text and the way it prefigured what actually happened. And we read that with an attention to the critical needs. Because critical needs is that which is needed to sustain life. So between those kind of two moves that I make in any course, which is about close reading and textual engagement, and the commitment to life, that's my whole substance of what I have to profess.
And it's not just in the classroom. We started off this discussion by explaining that we're sitting now at Express Newark, the place where you put together, co-curated an exhibit, Powers of the Unseen, and we're recording this in late July 2025, which means people really, really only have a few days to come catch this exhibit, and I cannot beg everyone enough to come have a look, please. But please explain to us, what is this exhibit, Powers of the Unseen, and what's going on, and what are you trying to do in terms of also, outside of the classroom, just opening up these forms of knowledge, these forms of reading, not just text, objects, art, into the community?
Yeah. Powers of the Unseen at its core is about the politics of representation. But it uses a core Sufi and more generally Islamic concept of the ghaib, or the unseen, as a way to see through this problem, right? And so traditionally the ghaib appears, in the Quran many times as a core concept, and it refers to fundamentally the divine, right? And an entire realm that is beyond human perception, right? And there was an analogy with the tradition of Muslim aesthetics, which has for hundreds of years been primarily what we would describe as Sufi, of trying to express the inexpressible, right? And so there was an analogy there with the problem of representation, or what we were calling the conundrum of representation today. So this exhibit wasn't so much about Muslims in Africa and the Middle East and in Newark. It was a way of seeing the world through the concepts and aesthetic traditions that those experiences offer all of humanity. And so it consisted of about 13 international artists, 12 of which are alive, right? One deceased, the great Gordon Parks, but there were Chester Higgins and Yazi Alipour and Kamila Janan Rashid and Malik Welly, Amina Kudus, so many really phenomenal artists, and all of the works engaged with photography as a medium, right? And conventionally, photography is a kind of spicy subject when it comes to Islamic thought, right? There's a whole robust debate about the permissibility of photography. But there were these very interesting experiments and engagements with the form itself that we wanted to explore with these artists. And there was a experience I had, actually, that I would like to share, of a community member, kind of an elder in the kind of Newark Muslim community, who came kind of in the past few weeks, and she visited the various exhibitions. Powers of the Unseen is one exhibit among several, part of the annual theme for Express Newark of ritual, with that my colleague Salamisha Tillett kind of, and Aaliyah Allen, directed and curated the whole kind of ensemble. But what the comment of this community member, she said, when you come in, you see pictures of Newark area African-American Muslims, and they were works by Nzinga Oyo, in which woven prayers, where there are like these tapestries of prayer mats and family portraits. And the elder said, oh, that's Islam, right? The first level. But then she said, when you come upstairs, you come into the gallery in which Powers of the Unseen is, you move through the other exhibitions, they take you from Islam to Iman, or faith, right? But then by the time you get into Powers of the Unseen, you arrive to Ihsan, right, or spiritual excellence. And I was really struck by her reading of the exhibit, right? Because by her own admission, she wasn't an art person. She didn't really know how to engage with the space. But then she had this incredibly sophisticated reading, grounded in the tradition of a self-understanding of how to read it. And I could see she was really quite moved by the exhibit, and accordingly I was moved by her being moved, that I couldn't imagine to have achieved such a thing. So I'm really grateful for the other curators, Alex Dika Segerman, Ode Ternay, and Sandrine Collard. We worked together for 3 years to put this exhibit on, and it has been an incredible life experience.
And what an amazing endorsement you received from this visitor, from this community member. Really, I cannot urge people enough to come check out the exhibit with the time that's remaining. So there's been Powers of the Unseen, and that's this exhibition that you've co-curated that's occupied you for several years now, and it's coming to a close. The book, Textual Life, Islam, Africa, and the Fate of the Humanities, coming out in October, although I think people can pre-order it right now with Columbia University Press.
Yeah, and there's a discount, a 20% discount, CUP20, if you buy it directly from the publisher.
After these big projects, what's next? What does the future look like? What are you on? What are you working on? What are you plotting? What is next?
As far as I can tell from every indication, the future looks African. And so I'm actually going to be moving to Mohammed VI University Polytechnic in Morocco, where I'll be an associate professor of African literature and philosophy, where I'll be continuing my work in global black studies, but grounding it on the continent in that kind of Walter Rodney tradition of grounding, doing so on the continent. And I have a few different projects that I hope to take off, but I'm really interested in developing networks of collaboration of African-based scholars, folks doing community-engaged work, alongside the textual commitments that I have in study of Kamara. I want to kind of make his work more widely available in conjunction with the Kamara Research Center in Senegal. And I also am continuing work that I've been doing with the Groupe d'Action d'Études Critiques in Saint Louis, Senegal, with Abdurrahman Seck and students and colleagues there, which is a decolonial collective. And so, there's tons of work to do, and I look forward to doing it on the continent.
And I look forward to keeping up to, what you'll be up to. This was not our first, and it's definitely not our last conversation about your work and about these things that we've been thinking on for quite some time. And really, really, I hope people will engage with your book. It's a beautiful book. There's a lot to be learned from it, both in terms of thinking, but also in terms of practice. What you said about your work in the classroom and as an educator, like really now struck with me. So again, I just hope that people will read the book, engage with it, and read it slowly, as we've learned, and adopt the textual life and textual attitude. Thank you so much, Wendell, for joining us on the podcast. It was really, really such a pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you so much, Madina. This has been a gift.